Baroness K. Swinburne is a Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Also part of the European Parliament, Vice Chairman, Committee on Economy and Monetary Affairs, Substitute Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, Member, Delegation for Relationship with the United States.
The British General Service Medal, Borneo Bag, 1962. Issued to P.W. Smith for his service in the Royal Air Force during the Indonesian-Malaysian confrontation. Medal number Y1945-971. This is an original British General Service Medal. Sovereign Wealth Funds Institute takes pleasure in honoring Baroness Swinburne, Good Fellow recognition for her contribution to the world. I invite Baroness Swinburne and Lakshmi Narayanan, the chairman of SWFI, to conduct the good talk with the awardee.
Baroness K. Swinburne is a Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Also part of the European Parliament, Vice Chairman, Committee on Economy and Monetary Affairs, Substitute Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, Member, Delegation for Relationship with the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my indeed honor and privilege to invite for the good talk. She is a Parliamentarian Under Secretary of State in the Department for Levelling Up. Please join me in welcoming the Baroness Swinburne today evening. How do you believe your diverse background from medical research to be in investment banking before entering politics?
It's been an unusual journey, and I think my children jest and say I'm probably a little before my time because I've had numerous careers. But actually, ultimately, there is a thread that goes through all of this. And it started with an academic interest. I was always academic as a child and living in a very remote part of West Wales and speaking Welsh as my first language, decided to go to London University. Went to London and then ended up very quickly finding I had a real penchant for biochemistry and anything that had to do with medical research. So I did a PhD in fairly record time, and by the time I was 23, I had enough research to be able to publish my dissertation and gain my doctorate. And I thought I was always going to work in the pharmaceutical industry or the biotech sector. That was the journey I thought I had planned out for myself. Until I went to the sector and decided I didn't have 30 years to wait before I could really make a difference day to day. And so I found a role for myself in investment banking, which was as a research analyst in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology space, where I could actually deal with senior management in the sector really early on in my career and really use my scientific knowledge as a unique selling point at the time as a doctorate in the subject. I could value a pipeline in a way that very few people could back. I'm very old, so on that basis, there were nobody else doing it at the time with my qualifications. So a scientist moving into that role was unusual here in London back in the early 90s. But the reality for me is that I've used that training, that knowledge, the way in which you look for the evidence, that you follow the data. I've used that throughout my career. And I ended up being the accidental politician when I one day met David Cameron when he first became leader of the opposition. And he persuaded me that giving a short period of time for public service, going and becoming an elected politician was a good thing to do. I'm not sure today he would have persuaded me to do the same thing, but it certainly for me was a way of giving back to society, having been an investment banker for a number of years and a hedge fund manager for a biotech fund. So for me, it was really important to give back. I went to Brussels as a member of the European Parliament, but I landed in Brussels in 2009, and many of you in this room will actually remember the financial crisis. And 2007-08 might have been painful for the city here and global financial centers around the world. But Europe and the European Union in particular took a really active role in regulating post-crisis. And I had the pleasure and privilege, it wasn't always a pleasure, but in the end it became one, of becoming one of the experts in financial services to help guide that legislation through Brussels. So 10 years after doing financial regulation, I came back to the city for 5 years, went back to the private sector, and now I find myself doing another year's service, having had a phone call from the Prime Minister asking if I would go into the House of Lords to do a ministerial job for a year. Little did I know it was going to be a year to the day. I didn't know the election was going to be called, but it ended up being the same week of the year before when he asked me to do 1 year's service for him.
Congrats for finishing the first year. What's an inspiration for, I know you said David Cameron convinced you or persuaded you, right? So I always say when people persuade, I say whether you get convinced, confused, or corrupted, right? That's how they look when they persuade, right? Because there's a beautiful, beautiful saying in the Greek, pathos, ethos, arthos, and logos. It's a message, messenger, the situation, and the tone of the message that is communicated. Mm-hmm. And all put together is what the persuasion works. So somebody convinced you. So I want to understand what made you to take. Yes, somebody saying something, but still something should have been inside your feeling that, yes, I should walk the path and try this one.
So partly, when you've had a successful career already and you've got to a really decent standing, you're very comfortable in what you do, sometimes you need that little edge, something to push you a little harder. And I'm not a risk taker, but I like to actually push myself as far as possible. And so for me, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that I could do something completely new. But it was also that opportunity to reconvince people that politics does make a difference. And if you fully engage, you can actually make a difference in that world. And it's a tough place to be. You have to grow some very, very thick skin. The social media these days is really painful. Whatever you say, you will have half the audience will dislike it. The other half will think you've actually said the best thing you could ever have possibly said when it was only a certain number of characters on a tweet or X, whatever I call a tweet these days would be. But the reality for me is that when you go into a circumstance that's new to you, you start from some very basic skills you already have from different areas that you've been in, and you just apply them to that new role. For me, it's very much about what is the problem I'm trying to solve. So going in there as if I were a scientist, saying, okay, what am I trying to solve? And therefore, where is the evidence? Where's the data? Can I therefore find a solution? And being able to think slightly differently. And because I'm not a career politician, I bring my science, I bring my finance, I bring it all to the table. And I hope I also bring the thread, which is a communicator. I like to find a simple way to explain to people certain very complex topics. And that, for me, I think, has been a really good thread throughout my life, being able to explain to people the very complicated.
You come from healthcare background, went into finance, but how you ended up in the housing?
Housing is the aberration, I think, on the basis that it's a ministerial role. And when you have a department that actually needs a minister, you get asked to serve. And the UK government is very different to what I knew in Brussels, where you would become an expert in a particular subject matter. So I did 10 years and became the vice chair of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, interacting every day with the SEC, with the CFTC, or indeed, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and we set up the European Supervisory Authorities. So you get that global perspective, you become the expert. In the UK and other national parliaments, it's much more about taking your skills and applying them to whichever vacancy they then have. And in this instance, I'm covering maternity leave for a colleague of mine who is away looking after her young son. And so I said I would go and do 6 months of this cover in the housing department. But it's a very steep learning curve, but it reinforces the message. It doesn't actually matter what the topic is. If you're prepared to learn, if you're prepared to take the expert advice around you, you can apply the same skill sets, the same rationale, the same reasoning to a problem and come up with a solution with the team.
You don't come from a political background. You become an accidental politician. So I want to go back and ask a question on that one. What made you to the Conservative Party achieve a victory in Wales after a century?
So if I give you some context, Wales is a very left-leaning member of the United Kingdom as a nation. And what will give you an idea is that since devolution in Wales, they have their own government covering devolved matters. It's always been a Labour government. So for 25 years, there has been a Welsh Labour government. Gives you an idea as to how it's a very left-leaning political system. So when I stood for election in 2009, I was told, you'd be lucky to get one of the 4 seats for Brussels. And Wales had 4 members of the European Parliament. That year, there was some aberration in the statistics because the Conservative Party, for the first time in electoral history, topped the polls. So we managed to actually come top of the polls, which I think surprised everyone, myself and David Cameron included. But there were a lot of issues with that. A lot of it was chance. It was a very bad turnout election, so smaller numbers coming out in 2009. But it was also a chance for me to connect with my region in West Wales, where I grew up. Being Welsh-speaking, the first Conservative candidate in the area to be able to speak in Welsh and be able to do my hustings in Welsh, to be able to really connect with a whole part of the Welsh community that hadn't associated conservatism with them. But they kind of, I think, saw in me someone who came from a very humble, very rural background, who'd made it into the city and had been successful and was now starting this new career. So they always described it that they loaned me their votes for that particular election. So I was very grateful to them, and they re-elected me again in 2014. So I was even more grateful the second time around.
Oh, I always want to connect dots in life. Sometimes something happens, you never realize why it happened. But when you turn back, at some point of time, you will realize they all led to something. When I was reading about you, trying to understand your past, I came across that you have been advocating for honeybees or bees. I don't know how many people know about the bees. Bees is one of the most powerful creature in the world. If the bees doesn't exist, the world doesn't exist. There are 20,000 bees, only out of 8 varieties of bees is what people know about it. The beauty of the bees is honeycomb, or the comb they built in, and the housing is all about that. I'm trying to connect there to here. The life is all about connecting and comb and things. I want to know what made you, inspired you to got into the bees. Nothing to do with you come from a healthcare, went into finance, politics. Why you are advocating for the bees?
So I'm a scientist at heart. And if you think about the pollinators, if we lose our pollinators, we lose the fundamental parts of our biodiversity and our nature as we would know it today. And so it's a bigger thread of climate change and what we need to do as society, as financiers, what we need to do to change behaviors in order to make sure that we don't do any more damage to our planet and to make sure that, those pollinators don't continue to die out. Now, this was back very early after my election, and Wales is very rural. It's full of a lot of farming communities. And so we have a Royal Agricultural Show for a week every summer. And so every summer I would have a campaign. And this particular one on the bees was an interesting one because the farmers wanted to be able to use all sorts of chemicals on their crops. And actually, most of them were killing the bees. And so to turn up at an agricultural show and launch a campaign to save the bees was not the most popular thing I could have done. But when you have a discussion with them about, well, actually, you really do want your crops to be pollinated. You really do want your production levels to be higher. You need the bees as much as anybody else. It's an interesting conversation to challenge them. And I think for me, it was the start of my journey on ESG. Brussels was a great place to learn about, on the environmental committee, which was my secondary committee, it brought the finance and the environment together. And so if you're going to look after, what the environment needs to do to change, you need the financing to do it. So for me, it was the very early days. I worked on the sustainable finance package in Brussels. So it brings it all together, whether it's COP26, whether it's the UN's biodiversity conferences. We have moved a long way in 10 years, where there is now a general acceptance we need to finance a different way of doing things. And for me, it all is a bit of a thread, and science underpins it. So the evidence was showing me the bees were endangered. The pollinators as a whole needed a slightly different attitude, and our attitude towards biodiversity also needed to change. And you need the finance to do it, so I can connect all of those dots and all of my experience and all of my networks together and hopefully start making a difference.
I can see you are an intellectually craving person. You have been jumping topics, various things in your life. What keeps you awake?
The challenges at the moment geopolitically are probably the worst in my lifetime. I feel that we need to take the threats on our doorsteps very, very seriously. And everyone needs to actually understand this isn't about somewhere else. This is possibly changing our way of life and the way we assume that peace is the way that the world will naturally gravitate to. I think we've taken it for granted for too long, and there are too many places around the world that are really uncertain right now. And as investors, people know the risk from the financial perspective, but I think from our own personal society, we also need to understand that the risk to our way of life is also potentially under threat right now. That's what keeps me awake at night.
Who is your inspiration?
I have a number of people, but ultimately it comes back to my family. It comes back to, I have a mother who raised me as a working mother. And she had a family business. I would have to go and work in the shop that she used to run in order for me to see my mother during the after-school hours. And that gave me a work ethic. It gave me an aspiration to do well. And the harder you work, somehow the more successful you become. So the more lucky you are because you work hard. So that stood with me in good stead, and actually I haven't lost that yet. My kids asked me over the weekend, when was I expecting to retire, given my role as minister comes to an end on the 4th of July, and I'm not doing another one. So they said, well, are you going to retire? You're actually going to come and live in the countryside permanently? And the answer is very simply no. I am about to start my new chapter. I will start, I hope, a new business. I'm ready to go all over again, and I'm excited at the idea of change and going out there to find the next thing that I can make a difference on.
So we will find a... So we will find somebody to persuade you when after July 4th. You decided you don't want to come, but still somebody should have you in the list.
No, we're fine. I have done a year. I said I would do a year's public service. I think 11 years in total is my due paid. So now it's time for me to find other things that interest me and to go make a difference in that broader community. And it may be back into the ESG world, or it may be sort of trying. I helped the former Lord Mayor here of London, Vincent Keaveney, organise a summit which was financing impact impact for finance, and finance for impact, even the other way around, where we were looking at the S in ESG and saying, how could we actually raise the social investment element and the social sort of commitment that people make when they invest in companies? How can we raise that in terms of a set of metrics? That still excites me, so I suspect I'm not done yet.
Do you have any strategies that can inspire, engage, and give back to the communities?
So I now know that my best laid plans seem to go amiss when politicians call me up. And so I had a 5-year plan from 2019, and my 5-year plan was cut short at year 4 when I got my phone call from the current Prime Minister asking me if I'd serve again. So I am now very relaxed at the idea that I may have a plan, but it occasionally gets diverted. And I'm quite happy now, at my age in life, going with that diversion. Because actually, when doors open, you need to have the excitement to go and actually step through it and go and see what's there. Can I make a difference? Can I add value when I actually go and help someone in a new situation?
How do you define your purpose?
I think I grew up in a tight-knit community. So I grew up understanding what purpose was from a very, very young age. And you didn't just do things for yourself, you did things for the community. And I think that's a really important thing, that when, children of today are much more distanced. They're much more, attached to a telephone or an iPad, a computer. Whereas we were out in communities doing community work. And I think, for me, therefore, my purpose started very early. It's still very much community-led. And I think the bigger purpose has been introducing ESG into the City of London and my old firm. I joined a Big Four when I left Brussels as an MEP and became vice chairman of their financial services division. But what I actually really think I did during that 4 years in that firm was to completely change the way that the whole firm thought about ESG. And actually, they all now, as senior partners, all get trained in ESG. They all know how to actually help their clients understand what's needed of them, not just to comply with regulation, but to also understand how they can make a difference in their communities. And I've been seeing some of that. I now need to connect a dot for you. In my housing communities in the last few months, I have seen various investor groups, particularly some of the leading impact investors in the UK, investing in really deprived areas in the north of England, supplying housing, supplying regenerated workplaces, and really making sure that a levelling up agenda works for everybody. So, it does come full circle, and you can bring the investment together with that real sense of purpose of trying to make a difference for everyone, not just for some.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my personal opinion. I always say every individual go through 4 phases in life. Phase 1 is income. They talk about money. Second stage is all about an identity. Third stage is all about an influencing the society. The fourth stage, a few people reach become an inspiration. We have one among us, an inspiring person in our life. You are a great inspirations. I believe strongly you will influence the community for the right cause. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a great applause for the Baroness K. Swinburne. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being here.